Right, okay, so that's us back recording. And we are into phase two. And this is just a reprise of what is Adobe After Effects and when to use it. I actually thought I had. Did I do? Yeah. Okay, so this was the start of it. Just to run through what we did yesterday, and please feel free to jump in with any questions when we're doing it. This was the workspace for Illustrator rather. We worked with the control panel, changing the figures for that kind of more accurate metrics configuration. We looked at a variety of tools within the tool panel. We understood that there were hidden tools there. We understood that the tools panel was about putting items onto the artboard and then editing them thereafter. We did some configuration with the sidebar, particularly spent some time looking at the gradients, the strokes, the transparency, the layers and the artboards. And obviously we talked about sort of the environment, the artboard and the workspace element of it. And then we created a rudimentary version of that logo. Again, if we've got time at the end, we can go through the kind of process of changing those. But have you got any questions just now about sort of what we did with that?
The only thing that I just couldn't quite remember how to do was when you created a square over the workplace and cut out everything outside the square, just to kind of crop.
That's the masking and the cropping. Yep. Okay. Yep. What I'll do is I'll show you that just quickly, because it's actually in a kind of similar but different way. Again, depending on how much time we've got, there's a similar effect that we would use in After Effects. It's called something different in After Effects, what we call as a masking effect in Illustrator. They would call it, kind of got to get my terms right so I give you the accurate terminology. It's called an alpha track. I'll come back to it. But what I'll do is I'll show you in Illustrator what we did. I'll just bring up this file here. This is the file that we'll ultimately be using when we are moving into After Effects. So just to remind myself here, it's called track matte is the effect in After Effects that we would call in Illustrator a masking. Okay, but we'll get to that. We'll go through the process of creating an animation later in the session, and we'll show how that's created. So the masking, what we do with the masking, like say for example we had this element and it was way bigger than it needed to be and it had went off the artboard. If we wanted to crop it to that shape, we can either create a square around it. It doesn't have to be the same size as the box, it can be any size out with it. Create the shape or create the space you want to mask it to, and with that top object selected, and I've just gone onto the selection tool and I'm pressing shift to hold down the additional object. So now I've got selection of both elements. You go to object, clipping mask and make, and it also gives you there the you'll see there the shortcut, which is Control 7. And when you've got that, it just crops it to the space. Just keeps a really tidy artboard for you to explore. I mean, an interesting thing is when we're exporting this, we didn't actually get to exporting yesterday on Wednesday when we did this. Whether I export this image as a JPEG with that cropped or even without it cropped, because what we would generally tend to do is export an artboard, it will still crop it at that stage. But for the purposes of a tidy workspace. It's good to be able to do that and to keep it so that you know exactly what is on each board. And sometimes if you're dealing with like multiple artboards within a single file, your next artboard, just to create another artboard, could be right over the top of it. And if you're exporting both of the artboards at the same time, you don't want the artwork from one piece of art to bleed onto the other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, I'll just show you quickly just what we do in terms of exporting, because we didn't cover that in the Wednesday. For the purposes of After Effects, you wouldn't necessarily need to know this, because we will be exporting full files, Illustrator files, as opposed to exporting them as JPEGs or PNGs. But it's useful to know for the purposes of creating web banner graphics, particularly. If you want to export a file, you would go to File, Export, and you've got a number of options. The best thing, particularly when we're doing web items, is to save for web, and that creates files which are a lot smaller, a lot more compressed in terms of the file size. You do save for web, and again you've got the shortcut there, which would be Control, Alt, and Shift, and S at the same time. And that brings up a new dialog box where you can control what kind of file that you're creating as a result. So in this case, you probably don't need a PNG. You would use a PNG file where transparency was important to the file. So if you needed it to be transparent for any particular reason, or have an element of it transparent. So if you're exporting a logo, for example, you don't want the background of that logo to be taken with it. You want it to be transparent. A PNG is the correct file to use. For the purposes of this, a JPEG at high level is probably best, and it will pre-populate the figures, so that it gives you that high quality but as compressed as possible. So it's saying 60%, but that's very, very good still. And then simply save. You should get an option for where to save it, and we'll just say AFTV. I'll just give it a file extension, not extension, a file name and convention of _web, so that I know that it's been saved for that purpose, and save it there. And so just to give you an idea about the kind of savings in terms of the file size for that, let me just hide Illustrator for a second. In fact, hide everything. So if I just look at the file size for that, we're talking 142 kilobytes. If I export this, without saving it for web, so what I did there to bring up the export, I think that's actually that's a custom shortcut I've created, so that's no use to you. If I just export regularly, export as, and just save it as a PNG, I'm going to click this button here to say use the artboard, as opposed to exporting all of the artwork. You've got a choice of exporting all of the artboards at the same time, or you can select a range of them. If you've got multiple, say if you've got 10 artboards open at the same time, you can select several of them, or all of them, or none of them, or well, you would never export none of them if you're going through the process of exporting them, of course.
Separate files.
Rather than just going file by file by file. When you're doing it for web, you do have to do it artboard by artboard. But when you're doing it, just if you're exporting generally, you can do multiples. So we're just going to do range 1 and going to export that one. You've got the option of making it screen size or high PPI. PPI stands for points per inch. Usually DPI is the term that would be used. Certainly in the print medium, you would always use dots per inch, but PPI is an alternative. So if I save that out as a high resolution PNG, let me see what size that gives me. It will be saved into tutorial files. Nope, don't know where that's been exported. So it was 142 when I've saved it for web. When I've saved it, there's 960. So it shows the significant sort of improvements you can make in the file size. Okay. So that's a little bit about masking, a little bit about exporting.
See in the program we were just in, the Illustrator.
Yep.
The layers, can you move the layers up and down?
Yes, you can.
Right, because I struggled with that yesterday, because I'd been and renamed them, and then I was like, how do I move this if I wanted to? Because I was going to go, well, I'll have the bottom block and then the next one, and then for the artwork.
So it should just be a simple drag and drop. So if I
Right.
want to take triangle 8 here, I can move it. Now, what you may have found is if you've got this version where you've got the line, what you're doing is you're pacing it, you're moving it into place in that order. If it's a full block like that, what you're doing is you're dropping the contents of that layer into another layer. So you can just move it up and down, and that organises it as such. Can you do that? I'm just wondering whether you can do that as whole collections. Like, say, for example, you wanted the lines to appear above the text. It looks like, yeah, you can do that all as one by selecting shift. So if you do a click on a layer and then shift on a layer, it will select everything between. Or if you click on one layer and I think it would be control, you can select particular layers and then move them accordingly.
I did try drag and drop, but I didn't persevere with it for too long.
That's fine.
Okay.
Okay.
And I have another question. See that grid that you have on? I did put
this
on
this
whatever
grid.
It's called, yes, several times yesterday, and I couldn't get the thing back off again. It was really nice.
Right. Okay. Well,
fine.
this grid is not actually a grid. These elements are pieces of artwork. Let me just hide some of them there. So these are part of what I'm going to be showing in terms of the design.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
So let me just do that. But what you're probably talking about is that what you saw?
No, it was one of the icons over on the left-hand side. They put on some type
On
of
the left-hand side. Oh right. Oh yeah. This one.
Perspective thing.
Yeah.
Like,
yes. Annoyingly, if you then choose a different item, a different tool item, you can't get rid of it. You need to select the perspective tool again, and then click on the X button to get rid of it. Yes, that is dead annoying. That I probably spent about 2 hours trying to figure that problem out, because when the new release came out that provided that tool, as you can imagine, there weren't very many tutorials available on how to use that tool, and so I'm searching the web looking for this thing that nobody knows how to do. So I probably wasted 2 hours.
I liked it. Obviously, it's for giving you kind of like pointers and where you're putting your shapes to and stuff.
Yeah, and because it snaps to the shape as well, you can it makes it far more kind of accurate. I don't tend to use that often, if I'm entirely honest. I think it's more something you're doing if you had a specific illustrative style in mind. When I'm doing drawings that require perspective, I tend to do that freehand and trace them as opposed to using a more kind of mechanical effect. Okay, you got any other questions on Illustrator that you want to cover?
What's the quickest and easiest way to just snap objects together?
Okay, so if we go to View, you have these options available. You've got Smart Guides, which just now is selected. Command U is the shortcut for this. Smart Guides are, let me go back. If I pull this, you'll see these purple lines, the pink lines. They're called Smart Guides.
Right.
So they allow you to kind of see where you're moving things to in relation to things. So that doesn't answer your question. What you were talking about was snapping. Snapping is slightly different. But it's useful to know that as an option. It's also, sometimes it can be useful to turn that off, because sometimes you do want to be able to place it where you want it rather than where it tells you it should go. So let me just move that back. If you want to turn it off, if you go back, if I show where it is, if you just click on the option there, it will remove it. So if I go in now and I move a piece of artwork, you'll see that it's not giving me any of those options. Okay. The shortcut again for that is U. So and U turns it on or off. You can see I'm starting to use that again, and I'm starting to get them. What you're talking about is snap, and I think from the looks of it, snap is available just now. And you get to that from guides. No. show grids. Yes, no, sorry there. Snap to pixel or snap to point. So just now, snap to point is actually turned off. It's probably I'm getting the snapping effect from the smart guides as opposed to snap to point.
Yeah.
So I can turn that on there. So now if I create a shape and I want to snap it by, let me just replicate the shape using the eyedropper tool there. When I take this object and drag it, it will, you see it snapped into place there?
Yeah.
It'll actually be a little bit more like if I just zoom in a wee bit so you can see what I'm doing. You'll see the effect. I'm going slowly. And there it snapped.
Yeah.
Yep. These are all good things to be able to use simply because if we take the idea that a good clean artboards, good clean artwork within the board are important. Snapping things to it shows that you've got perfect alignment as opposed to, I mean, when I look at junior designers that don't consider this kind of thing, if I look at the outlines of, so this what I did there was I changed it to, rather than looking at the artwork, I've changed it to the outlines. So you're just seeing basically a wireframe of it. If I look, one of the quickest ways to tell if there is a clean designer or a messy designer is if you go into your files and you see like that. That damages my head when I see that in a graphic designer because whilst
Perfectionist.
well, the thing is that it quite possibly will make little difference when we're talking about print work because print work has these kind of tolerances.
Yeah.
But see on a piece of web work, that slight change will make the last pixel on the edge of a document that tiny wee bit lighter, and whilst 80% of people won't notice it's there, the 20% that do notice it are the vocal ones that will highlight it to you, and it takes up so much of your time correcting stuff like that. It's better at the very start to be able to be aware of that and make sure that it's nice and tidy and cropped. Okay. Okay, so do you have any other questions on Illustrator that you want to cover?
No.
No? Okay, so let me go back into the keynote. Okay, so what is After Effects and when to use it? So this is just a reprisal of what we had. This is just some of the work that I've done with After Effects. This is what we'll be aiming to make later on.
Oh, excellent.
Just show that again. So that's an example of a logo reveal. Did that start? There we go. But equally, I mean, this could be an example of a stinger that we're creating, because what I've done is I've applied a transparent background to it,
Right.
so you can see through it, so it can act as a stinger effect. This was used as a stinger as such, but basically as a part of a rotating presentation for the Ideal Home Show. This business were exhibiting at the recent Ideal Home Show, and they were doing a competition. They were highlighting the fact that they did home insurance and life insurance as well as wealth creation management, that kind of thing. So that's what that was used for. This is a job that I'm working on just now, so this hasn't even been released to the public. This is gonna work, right? Okay. And what I've did was I filmed various members of staff doing a boomerang effect video, so they're just doing something in reverse, whilst a Swiss design kind of pattern rotates around, and that's just part of sort of their annual review web page that they've created, just to show some of the staff, to highlight some of the staff, to demonstrate the energy that they've got as part of it. So the animation in the middle was what was created within After Effects. This was a broadcast, if that works. This will take 10 seconds to kick in. This is just a bumper advertisement for C.R. Smith on the Riverside show on STV.
The Riverside Show, sponsored by Fix from C.R. Smith.
Okay, so that's an example of broadcast that it could be used for. And I've forgotten what this one is. Oh, yeah, it's the Stingers. So, live stream. Okay. So that's a variety of things that it can be used for. We'll zip through the interface, and like I say, we'll try and get through these elements a lot quicker than we did with the Illustrator. Partly because there are far fewer things to show. But partly because I want to make sure that you guys have got as much opportunity to kind of get hands-on with this as possible. Okay, so this is the interface. This is what you'll see when you come onto After Effects. Here are the elements. So in place of the control panel, you have the tools panel. The tools panel appears along the top. I suspect simply because there are fewer tools within After Effects. What After Effects does is more focused on configuring and defining movements as opposed to creating the artwork. You can create artwork to a certain degree in After Effects, but that's not its wheelhouse. You're best to take artwork either from bitmap images, like bitmap programs like Photoshop, but most in particular Illustrator, and compositing them there as opposed to creating them within After Effects. So there are fewer tools, and the tools are less about creation, they're more about the manipulation of the objects on the compositions. We've got the projects panel here, and that basically is where all your assets are held. So elements of artwork, the compositions that you create with those artworks, and they can be organised into different groups based either by the composition that you're creating, or organised by the outputs that you're creating. So you may have within a single file the stinger animation and the lower thirds animation, and other elements within one file if you so desired. I wouldn't necessarily go down the route of having the stinger and the lower thirds in the same file as the credits, for example, because the credits has a lot more detail and you want to keep it as light as possible. But where there are common assets, it makes a little bit of sense to have them within one file, because if you make changes to one asset, then that can get propagated through to the others. So you can group these by either the composition that you're working on or by the outputs that you're creating. Over on this side, you've got your configuration panel, and it's similar to the Illustrator in so much as it controls sort of how things are aligned and arranged, and some transparency can be added to this panel. Again, it can be configured so that you've got the tools on it that you would most likely use. But as I said, similar to the to Illustrator, you'd be using this for editing the objects that are on your composition. When I talk about composition, I think composition is similar to the artboard in Illustrator. Timeline panel is really where the strength of After Effects is. That's where you define what objects exist on a composition, when they appear on the composition, how they move on the composition, how they appear in terms of their position, their transparency, their location according to their anchor points, and other configurable aspects. It also is where you define if you apply any effects to the objects on the timeline within the composition. There can be various types of assets. There can be imported graphics, which we'll show you. You can import video onto the timeline, as you saw with the incremental, the circle with the fellow doing the boomerang. Text can go in there, solid color, solid blocks. Null objects are quite interesting. I don't know too many uses for null objects beyond controlling the position of a camera, but you can apply a camera to the timeline as well. That's a weird one to get your head around. It's probably the one that took me longest to get my head around. Rather than necessarily having an object, you can put a camera onto the timeline so that it defines what you're looking at it from certain angles. And by associating that with a null object, you can easily move the camera around. And I'll show you that. I doubt it's something that you guys would be using. Certainly the work that I'm producing, you shouldn't have any sort of need for that, but it might just be an interesting kind of, if we've got time to show how that.
So is it an
works.
object that you can't see?
Yes, it's not, but you can use to manipulate.
Manipulate control of other things that you can see.
Absolutely, exactly. So what you're doing is you're taking, if you, I don't know if the detail on this is, in fact I can't even get the cursor up to show you. I'll show you on screen here. What you're doing with a null object is you're placing a null object and a camera on the timeline, and you have this wee spiral effect, and what you can do is you just drag that spiral effect for, say, the null object over onto the camera, and then it basically it connects it. So anything that you do to the null object applies to the camera. And so that means that if, for example, you zoom the null object out, the camera zooms out. As an example. Okay, as I said, with the objects, depending on what type of object it is, you can variously control that and define its parameters at different points along the timeline. And as you can imagine, by defining different values at different points in the timeline, that's how you create the motion and the animation. So if you say at one point in the, to take the first example, transparency, if you put an object onto the composition and you say at this point in the timeline it will be 100% transparent or opaque, but at a later point it will be 0%. When that begins to animate, it will animate variously through 100% down to 0% and therefore disappear on the composition. Similarly with position, if you define it being one position according to X and Y values, you can even do Z values as well in terms of going, if we go down the route of 3D. But if you define it at one point according to X and Y, and then at a different point at X and Y along the timeline, it will move from one point to the other. You can also control the route that it takes on that and the speed that it takes to create that motion. We'll go through these when we're demonstrating the animation that we'll create. And there's your composition. So this is like the artboards. This is rendering what has been defined within the timeline layers. Objects can be selected and manipulated on the composition or in the timeline. So you can select if you want to, like for example, if we were editing, if we're seeing the example on the screen, the presenter name and the job title, we can double click on that text and edit it there. Or we can edit it, we can select that object from the timeline to manipulate it. Okay. So does everyone, let me just go back a wee bit, does everyone feel that makes sense? Actually, quick question, has anyone been in After Effects and used the interface?
Just briefly.
Just briefly?
Just briefly.
John, have you used After Effects before? You guys not went into that? How did you find it?
It is just getting used to the Adobe products, I think, is the thing. But yes, it's footery, trying to put in those wee kind of, I don't know if they're nodes or whatever they're called, for whenever you start something, whenever you finish something. Yeah. So I was just working my way through some of the Adobe tutorials. Yeah. Because they've got a whole range of them, and it's time consuming.
Yes. No, absolutely.
Time consuming, probably the best.
Absolutely. I mean, the what I found in terms of my career, I spent like 18 months sort of as a freelancer, doing tutorials in a similar fashion. In the first 3 weeks of working with someone side by side, I learned more than that 3 weeks than I did the previous 18 months. So perhaps going through this and showing and with particular examples, maybe that will sort of help. But even being very familiar with the Adobe suite, I still found After Effects to be an absolute brick wall of a learning curve for the first few weeks. And it was only bit by bit, example by example, that I got a little bit more competent, a little bit more confident with it. So, okay, so what we're doing is basically we're going to take that Argyle Financial brand and we're going to import that to After Effects, and hopefully by showing the tidy configuration of the Illustrator file, how much easier that makes producing the artwork for within After Effects. Essentially what we're doing is we're taking the layers component in After Effects and we're bringing it into the projects panel the layers assets within Illustrator and bringing it into the projects panel within After Effects. So I'll just go through that process just now and show that in demonstration. I'll go through these elements once and then we'll come back, have a quick break, reprise it, and then we'll do the hands-on, and we'll try and get through that very, very quickly. Okay, so if I go to Illustrator, this is the file that I've set up. I know we've covered this a couple of times, but what I just want to show again is the layers panel. I'm just going to make that a little bit taller so you can see the range that we've got. That's all of the layers on that page. So we have 15 lines. That's these lines across the horizontal and across these diagonals. We have 12 triangles, and these are each of the triangles of the brand. We've got the background, which is this dark grey colour, and we've got in here text. I'm just going to move that back up to the top. In fact, no, I'll move it below. And we've got a text layer, which is basically the Argyle Financial typography there. Okay, and as you see, they're all named, which is important. If you create this from scratch and you just create these, however many layers it is, 30 to 40 layers. If you just create those layers, it will just name them layer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 all the way through. When you import that into After Effects, it will import it with that name. So it's vitally important, I think, to name them so that you know which ones are which as you do it.
I haven't had an experience with another product. Not naming things is a recipe for an absolute management nightmare down the line.
Absolutely. I mean, it works out.
Trying to work out, where does this go again?
Yeah.
Where did it come from?
It's such poor economy of scale to think that by saving your time by not naming it is going to save your time in the project in general, because
pay for it in spades if you don't name it.
absolutely paying for it in spades is a great way of explaining it. So I'm always quite keen to sort of name that. I mean, part of it is that kind of OCD kind of, I just like things to be tidy. I like as little chaos as possible. But it really does save you a huge amount of time when we get to that, as we will just demonstrate this very second. So I'm going to go into After Effects, and I'll just close this. Oh, I shouldn't have closed that then. That's going to take a wee while to load up again. We'll just do this from scratch. So this is me loading up After Effects. It'll probably take a wee while. On my computer at the office, this happens very quickly. It's a lot more powerful than the laptop is, I'm sure you can imagine. So just wait a wee second. So that wasn't too bad. So that's what we get when we load it up. You are generally given the start option, so you can create something new that way. So what we'll do is just click on Create New here, and it's given us this document. What I'm going to do is immediately give it a name or save it, so we start that process. So you can either do that by doing Command S or using the filing system, the menu system. So we're going to go Save As, and we'll create this as training example Argyle Financial, and just save that there. That should be saved within the filing system. Or is it on the desktop? Is that where I'm getting confused? Yeah, there it is there. So that's the file has been created now within there. Okay, So what I'm just simply going to do is drag that completed file. I'm just going to exit, just remove this file, close this file down. Just going to close Illustrator because all the work has been done there to make sure that that is in the state that is easiest to manipulate when we go into After Effects. I believe this is the file. So I'm just going to drag it and drop it into the project folder. And it's going to give me the option. I don't know why it keeps asking me this. So there's the option that I'm getting when I'm importing it. It's given in the head of the dialog box, it's told me what the name of the file is, AF_TV, and it's asking me what kind of import I'm asking. Do I want to import it as a composition or as footage? In this case, I'm doing it as a composition because what we're doing is we are creating a composition. We're not creating footage, I suppose. We have the option there to define how you want the elements of the file to be brought in. Do you want it to be by the document size or by the layer size? And what I'm wanting to do is bring it in by the document size, quite specifically, because if I bring it in by the footage size, each element that I import onto the desktop will be isolated to the shape of that layer. So if I bring in a triangle, it will come in loosely as a square. Whereas if I bring it in at document size, it will actually place that triangle where it is within the document, so that when I bring it in, it will still retain the shape and the positioning on the file. So I'm going to bring it in by document size. And there what it's done is it's done two things. It's brought it in as a composition. You see the icon there states that to be a composition. Okay, but what it's also done is brought in the individual layers should I need them. Now those individual layers, let me see if I can get an example of the triangle. We're not seeing that there because it's so small within it. You'll see there's a wee green dot there. That's basically that triangle in that position within the file. So it's imported it as a widescreen configured file in position. But it also, so it's brought in the layers independently, but it's also created a composition. Now if I double click on this composition, it will bring the composition into the main window. And you'll see that it has all of the layers pre-named and pre-positioned according to how the Illustrator file was arranged. Okay? And what it's done as well is it has imported it onto a composition of 30 seconds, which probably is the previous composition that I worked on. If you had previously wanted to have a minute-long composition, it would have, or if you were previously working on a minute-long composition, it would have imported it to a minute. If you want to change the duration of that composition, the shortcut for that is Control K. Again, this is where my faults as a power user come in. That I don't actually know what the menu route to that is. Composition settings. Yeah, that was relatively easy. So it's under composition in the menu or Control K. You can name the composition there. You can change the size of the composition. You can change the frame rate, the pixel aspect ratio, so it conforms to various types of media. You can ask it to render it full, half, third or quarter. This is a relatively simple piece of artwork that we're working, composition that we're working on. If you were working on a very complex animation, you might want to drop that down to half or even a quarter resolution, because the processing power to render at full will be, will slow down the process. This is relatively small, and because we're working on a very low resolution overhead projector here, we'll just keep it on full for now. But you can change the duration of it here. So if I want to change this to, let's just change it to 45 seconds. We can do that. You also have the option of changing the background color. Now that doesn't have, if you put on artwork onto a composition, you have the option to either export it with the background or without the background. So at this stage, if you're working on with artwork that requires it to be a light background, you can simply click on this. I don't know why I keep getting this error message up. Could not parse mask shape on the clipboard. I don't know how to clear the clipboard on After Effects. So, in fact, what I'll do is just open this quickly and put something else on the clipboard. Right, so what's on the clipboard now isn't masked, so hopefully we should not get that error anymore. Yes, back to the background colour. When we're exporting this, if we're exporting it for lower thirds, we'll want transparency to be part of it. But what you pick here doesn't necessarily mean that that's what the background has to be. If you want to have it with a background colour, you can choose it to have that background colour. What hopefully we will be creating will be will require transparency. So all I'm wanting to do is, and because the background colour that we'll be working with is a dark background, black is probably fine for now. But you can change that to be white if the artwork that you're working with requires a white background, or is it ultimately going to be on a very bright background.
So it's really just for the contrast for you while you're working with
Yes,
it?
absolutely. Correct. It's about the contrast. Okay. So you can't even see the background colour there because the background layer that we've imported fills the space anyway. But so you know it's there, I'll just hide the background there, and there it is, black. Okay, so let's just take this, show you what the timeline does, because this is the most important thing within it. Let me take the text as the kind of the clearest one that we can manipulate that you guys will see. So this is the text layer here. I've just selected it on the timeline, and you can do a number of things across this panel. Let's just start at the left hand side and work our way right. First of all, the eye tool allows you to hide the elements. You may have imported layers that are as guides, for example, for your artwork. You may, like for example, if you had to configure it, a piece of, if you want to configure your composition so that it, when you brought elements and things lined up, you might have like a guide layer imported. You don't want that guide layer to ultimately end up within the video, so turning off the layer by clicking on the eye hides that, and it won't appear within the export if you do that. The lock button, I'll only focus on the ones that you may potentially use. The lock button, if there is an element which you don't ever want to change. So for example, if we're working on lower thirds and we've got an animation, a composition for an animation, we don't want to change that at any stage. We only want to be focusing on the text. We can lock that layer so there's no threat of you moving it around. So now when I go onto the site, I can't actually pick up the Argyle Financial text there. It's actually picked up the line instead of that. There's nothing I can do there to pick up Argyle Financial because it has been locked. Okay, so I'm just going to turn that off. This arrow, if you click on it, it reveals the different parameters that you can edit. So let me just pull that down. So what is brought out there is, with the text, is the option of transform. Because we've not applied anything in terms of effects, the only thing that's available for us to edit at this stage is transform. And these are the elements that we can transform: the anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. Okay, you'll see these wee stopwatches on them. This is what you would click on if you want to do your first keyframe. So for example, if I wanted to change the position of the text within the artboard, with the timeline at 0, if that's the point at which I wanted to start it, I would click on that wee stopwatch, and you'll see it's created a little keyframe. So what you were calling a node earlier on, you would call a keyframe within After Effects. So that's placed a keyframe onto the timeline. Okay, and what I can do to change that configuration or begin to manipulate some animation is drag the timeline slider along. So let's just move it to 2 seconds. And I can click on this. Oh no. You only have to move the you only have to click that once to get the first keyframe up. Thereafter, if you want to change it, by changing the values either through the metrics available on of that element. So I can just, so this is for X and Y. If I click and then I drag it, you'll see it's created a keyframe on the timeline, a little blue dot. So let me just move that off the artboard entirely. If I go back to the start of the animation, you'll see it's animated. It actually animates it out in this case because I've started it in where I wanted it to, but I've animated it out. So I'm just going to press space to play the animation. You'll see it's just animated off the screen. Now, for the purposes of a logo reveal, you generally wouldn't start with the logo on the page and then animate it out. You would do it in the opposite direction, and that's very easy to change. You can change that in a number of ways. You can either click on a keyframe and then drag it to be the position that you want it to be. So in this case, I'm just basically going to swap them out. So if I go back to the start now, it should go in the opposite direction. Okay, so that's animated it onto the page. The other alternative for it is, so if I just move that back, if you drag and select both of the keyframes and you press, I want to say control, control, you get up the menu. You have what's called a keyframe assistant, and within the keyframe assistant you can time reverse the keyframes. So that has basically done in a far more efficient way what I did by pulling stuff around, far more accurate way. So now when I animate it again, it animates it back on. Okay, and the same principle applies with scale, rotation, opacity, and anchor point. I wouldn't worry about too much about anchor points. You're getting into fine details when you're trying to change the anchor point of an object on the composition. But just to demonstrate these, you can do multiple things at multiple points for an object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the opacity of this object at the start, but I want it to be fully visible by the time it's entirely on the board. So I'm just going to move it to, say, that point. I'm going to change that down to 0, and I'm going to do that thing I did before by swapping the reversing the keyframe time reverse. So now when it comes in, if I just, this is called scrubbing when you're manually moving an object across a timeline. You'll see it fades in as it's moving in to the point where it becomes visible when it's fully on the board. Okay. Let's just do the others whilst I'm at it. With the scale, I want it to start at 0, so it kind of animates in. So I can drag it, but I can also click on the figures and define it as 0. And then just move this along a little bit, along the timeline, and then change that to 100%. And now you'll see you've got 3 things going on at once here. You've got it moving in, you've got the opacity coming up, and you've also got the scale coming in. Okay. And if you're going to go the next hog and do some rotation on it, what I'll do is I'll start it just very, very subtly at, say, 30 degrees. Move it along to the end and change that to 0, so it ends up in the original position. We now have this being edited in 4 different fashions. Okay. Now, because I've actually done these at all different points, that happened in a very haphazardy fashion. What I'll do is I'll just move them all together so that they happen at the same point.
Can you
Loosely.
select them personally?
Sorry?
Can you select a group?
Yes,
select?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Do that, so you can extend them and move them to different points. So if you want it to happen faster by moving it closer, slower by moving it out.
And also see the scale. So you set 1 to 0, 1 to 100.
Yep.
And it automatically just stretches out to become it. Is it possible if you wanted to have a situation where it was started up at that size and jumps straight to that size without it? Does it always stretch out?
Yeah, I mean, what
I'm not sure why you'd want that. It's just a concept.
you would do that by moving it to the keyframe right next to it.
Right.
So, for example, let's say there. So the scale is this panel. What I'm going to do is, just so I can get a little bit more fine detail, as you can imagine, this is stretched across 30 seconds. Sometimes you may need a lot more precision than this is offering. You can actually zoom in on a particular area by dragging this top timeline scrubber, and you'll see what, whilst I'm bringing this in, it's extending it further out to the point if I take it right up to the nth degree, it'll start telling you which frames. So that's literally the frames that it's on. So you see there, I've actually positioned that in the wrong frame there, and you'll see it jumps between them now because you're literally doing frame to frame at that level. You can move this, either you can get more detail by moving this out or down, or you can drag it as a group like that. So let me just move this from here to here. Right, so on the scale, let me just expand this out again. Move the scale a lot closer there. Basically zoom the timeline. For the purposes of demonstrating it, I'll not start at 0, I'll start at 50. But actually you can see there, that's went from 0 to 50 to 100 in a short course. So that's going from, now it's going from 0 to full. Now you're right to observe that you would never really want to do that because there are better ways of managing that process. Let me just bring this out a wee bit. In fact, I need to zoom in to take this back. If you just wanted it to appear, rather than scaling it up to appear, which is a very crude way of doing it, you could simply take the image in general and drag that. You see I'm dragging the left edge of that, and it still has, you can still see sort of the background of it. Just move that into position, and now basically that doesn't exist within that timeline now at that point until it appears. So when I drag it, and then it appears the moment that it does. So you've achieved the same object, but in a far more, for want of a better word, a far more elegant fashion. Okay, so there we've edited it across 4 different characteristics: position, scale, transparency, and rotation, and it's flown in a jazzy fashion. Now, one of the things that you'll note, this is, again, we're getting into kind of areas of actually being quite fancy about how you do it. You'll notice when I begin animating this, it animates in a very linear fashion and stops suddenly. Okay? That reminds me of the 1980s, if you know what I mean. It just comes out, stop. What you would want to add a little bit more elegance is maybe to have it accelerate in and then slow down as it arrives in its point. You can do that fairly easily.
Or just go past its point and go back.
You can do those things as well to give the wee bounce effect. Well, do you want me to show you the bounce effect?
Fine.
Yeah. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to remove I'm go back to start. I'm going to remove everything except the position. So I'm just going to drag and select the scale, rotation, and opacity keyframes, and I'm just going to press delete, just delete it. So now we're back at a position where the only thing that happens is, it helps if we give it some scale. helps if we put that in the right position. And does that give us it yet? What's missing? Opacity. Okay, so we're now back to a position where we've just got it moving in once. So again, just to reprise, it comes in fairly static. You'll notice there's a wee bit of slowdown there just because it was rendering as it was animating. The second time we do it, it should come in a lot smoother. Okay, but it's just stopping. But what we want to create is a nice smooth conclusion to that movement. And the way to do that is if you select a keyframe, you can select one or you can select multiples. In this case, we'll just do it with the single because we're not asking it to accelerate in, we're just asking it to slow down as we go in. If we press Control over that keyframe, we can again go to Keyframe Assistant and change that to Easy Ease, which is perhaps one of the coolest terms in design. It just makes me think of the rapper, NWA guy, Easy E. And click on that and it changes from a diamond shape to this kind of, I want to say a girder shape. And that is an example of an Easy Ease. So now when we do it, and it'll probably go quite slow the first time, you'll see it's decelerate into position there. Okay. There's rendered a bit better. So that's nice and softer. A softer conclusion there. You can take this a further distance. Do you want me to show you an even fancier way of doing this? What we're doing is we're configuring this using the metrics available within and very crude, not necessarily integer numbers, but very crude numbers. But you can go even fancier that with vectors and vector graphs to define it. See this button up here? This allows you to do things far in advance. So I'm just going to select that keynote and I'm going to click on the graph editor and you'll see it gives you a graph that defines this slowdown. You see how it's slowed down very, very slowly there. If we click on this, you can change the impact of it. That's not what I meant to do. You can change the velocity impact of those. So generally, I don't know why it's not giving me, generally it gives you some tools that you can pull this graph, but we can do this using the menu system. So I'm pressing Control on the keyframe there, and I'm going to keyframe velocity. And an Easy Ease gives you an influence of 33%, which is a fairly standard way of slowing it down. If you increase that influence to say 50, in fact, let's demonstrate it with a little bit more force and change them both to 70. Press OK. You'll see it changes that graph to be even more elongated. So when I hide this again, it still keeps that Easy Ease file, but what you'll see is it will be even slower into position now. You'll see that it was a wee bit faster when it leaves, but it takes longer to slow down and easier into position. It just gives another easier kind of impact. And it will change that graph. If you change the position on the of the keyframe within the time frame to make it a little bit more intense, it will still give you that eased effect. It'll just do it in a lot shorter space. So that's it first whilst it was rendering. This time you'll see it a lot smoother.
And if you turn the graph right completely the other way, it would start slow and finish fast.
Yes, absolutely. You can influence both. So if I was to take that keyframe and change it to Easy Ease, go into here and then edit this one, you'll see that impact now. You don't have to be in the keyframes, you can be in the graphs and show this. You see it slowly came in, then accelerated, and then slowed down.
So it's Easy Ease as a utility for making it just easy to do those.
Yeah. it makes it easy to ease it.
Start and end of animations.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes it easy to ease it.
Yeah.
Ease it in, ease it out. Okay. Okay, so that's the basics of creating the keyframes within it. The other thing that I wanted to show was there's this one, the motion blur. Again, that we're getting into kind of this is how you make it look particularly fancy. I'm just going to go back and I'm going to take why am I not selecting that? I'm going to just change this back to being a standard. What I did there was press Control and click on it just to remove the easy ease effect very quickly. So we're doing this with a very slow motion there. I'm just going to move this a little bit tighter so this all happens very, very quickly now. And you'll see that if I take that off and that, again, you have to watch carefully for this to happen. You'll see there it came in and there was no blurring whatsoever. It's just done it frame by frame. What we can do is with this option selected and with this option highlighted, it enables the viewing of a motion blur. Again, if you're working with very advanced animations, you might not want to have that on whilst you're rendering it because it slows it down. You'll see now when we render it, when we play the button on this one, you see there's a wee bit of blur there at its fastest point. It just makes it look a little bit more realistic. If you look at the early part of it coming on, you saw a wee bit of motion blur there. It's a nice way of just making it look a little bit more slick when you're producing it.
It's one of these things that you don't really notice when it's there.
Yeah.
But you notice it when it's not there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So just to show you what it looks like if I take it off. Versus.
It just looks more right, shall we say, when it's got the motion blur on it.
Yeah. Okay. And the other thing was just the connecting element. So if I go back and I show this, if for example I wanted to bring in all of these triangles at the same time, what I can do is with the animation at the start of the video, what I'll do is just to show it so I don't have to undo a bunch of things, I'll just move to text and I'll reverse frame these. So what we're doing just now is we're animating out rather than in. Yeah. Okay. What I'm wanting to do is change it so that the triangles all follow Argyle Financial off without having to individually animate each of the layers. So I'm going to select all of the triangles. So what I've done is I've clicked on the bottom one, I've pressed Shift on the top one, and that selected all of them. And as I tried to describe earlier on, we've got this kind of swirly icon. If I drag one of those and put it onto the text, you see it's created that line as if it's lassoing it. Do you see the blue line?
Mm-hmm.
It's added this drop down to it, and it's basically said that it's now associated to the movements of all of these. So now, without having to animate all of the triangles, if I press play on this, it'll animate them all going off at the same pace as it. And that's just a massive time saver. And so if I go into here, you'll see now because of the position of the text, I only took it just off the artboard. If I now edit anything to do with the text, it will have the same impact on every single one of the triangles. So if I want to move it so it's a little bit further off the board, you'll see I'm moving just the text and I'm moving all the triangles as a result. It's actually because I've done that at a different point in the timeline. It's actually doing it in 2 stages. Okay, but the same applies if I change, for example, the opacity of it. If I take that down, it'll. I rather expected. Oh no, that's just in terms of motion. That only works in terms of motion. The effect that you positioning of the objects. So it doesn't work with the opacity, but I'm pretty sure it works with the other elements. So if I change the rotation of the text, it rotates in relation to that. If I change the scale of it, it should change the scale in relation to it. So they now effectively become one object. So I'm just going to move that back so they're there. Okay. So that's the crux of the changes. It's now combining all of them at different stages so that they do things that you want it to do. That becomes interesting. Do you, in terms of timing, that's coming up for 11:30. Have a break, and then what we'll do is we'll combine these and I'll talk you through them so you get hands-on immediately. It'd be very easy for me to go through and show what we're going to do to create this animation, but I think we can do it step by step, similar to what we did before. I think it'll be a lot easier because we'll be doing these things by using numerical values rather than trying to click things around and everything. So I think we'll very quickly see some changes to that. Okay. So I'll take 5 minutes. Okay.
I didn't get a third laptop or sorry, second. Well, we've got the 2, haven't we? I didn't get
That's
one
fine, that's
because they required credit card details and I just wasn't giving them over.